Good evening, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mary Bruce, Assistant Director of Public Programs at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. We are an academic and public forum that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. Every 4 years marks a transition for the leadership of U.S. democracy. And the first 100 days of that transition, in particular, can set the course for the new administration's priorities, policies, and leadership style. In this second term, President Trump has moved quickly and taken action to change policy on a number of fronts. He's also signaled a willingness to test democratic norms. So, to examine the effects of the new presidential leadership during its initial phase, we are offering a new multi-part series, The First 100 Days from Home to Abroad. Thank you for being a part of that. Each program in the series will explore a different facet of executive power and its effects on particular communities and the functioning of democracy itself. We're delighted to be presenting the series with Hopkins at Home and the alumni in government, academia, law, and policy community. Thank you for your partnership. We also want to thank SNF Paideia, the program at the University of Pennsylvania, and the SNF Ithaca initiative of the University of Delaware's Joseph R. Biden Jr. School of Public Policy and Administration. Tonight, our focus is on executive power and how presidential authority reshapes democracy and daily life. We'll be guided in this exploration by two terrific members of the Hopkins community, Robert Lieberman and Ido Harlev. Robert Lieberman is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University and an expert on the development of American democracy. Ido Harlev is a junior, double majoring in history and political science, and Professor Lieberman's research assistant. They're not only brilliant, it's also incredibly fun to watch them think together. So, as with all programs we host, we seek to use our time together to create a space to exchange ideas, gain insights, and learn frameworks for meaningful civic participation, a modern Agora, if you will. So to that end, we actively invite you to share comments and questions in the chat, and we'll be looking at those throughout the conversation. And this includes students joining in at a watch party in Baltimore. So hello, student watch party. So I'd like to start the question to everyone joining in now. We've got folks from across the country posing a question to the audience. In a word or a phrase, thinking about this conversation of presidential authority, in a word or a phrase, what's a thought or a feeling about tonight's topic? We'll see what folks are saying. So why'd you show up tonight? In a word or a feeling, presidential authority. And I will ask Rob the same question as you think about this, in a word or a phrase.
The word that comes to mind is just exhaustion. I mean, I know we're only a month in, but the pace at which stuff is coming at us is pretty mind-blowing.
Ido, how about you?
I think my word is intrigue. Just feels completely new to me and interesting to see how things are happening.
I'm seeing folks tuning in with a range of emotions. Anxious, scared, terrified. My word is eager. I think I'm excited to have this conversation and be in community with folks. Divergent ideas coming through on the chat, and an eagerness to understand. And one of the questions I've been getting most frequently is, how do we make sense of this all? And what do I do about it? Well, democracy and governance can be a messy process, especially in times of transition. And this conversation will reflect that reality. We're not having a scripted speech tonight, but we're having the opportunity to be in that messy middle of understanding and witness the student and professor exchange their ideas. So, Rob, Professor Lieberman, the first question is for you. What are the boundaries and tools of the president's authority? Or stated differently, wait, can the president do that?
Well, the president's authority is very extensive in the United States, but it's generally understood to be constrained or limited by law. I mean, the Constitution set up a limited institution, We all know about the checks and balances that are sort of embedded in the Constitution. The president can veto laws that are passed by Congress, but the Congress can override the veto. The president can make appointments or negotiate treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. So we know that the president can do things under certain constraints. The Constitution was designed deliberately to make it difficult for a single individual or a single party to gain complete control over all the levers of power in the government. Beyond the Constitution, policy and law generally empower the president to do certain things, and constrain him from doing other things. Presidential power has been growing a lot over the 20th and 21st centuries in ways that Ido and I have been exploring in our research. But mostly because Congress has given the president power. But generally, it's still understood that the president's power is limited to things that Congress has sort of outlined. Where we are now is that a president who seems intent on pushing the boundaries, testing the limits, and seems, I don't know if unconcerned is the right word, but seems unafraid of sort of pressing beyond where previous presidents have gone in terms of articulating and enacting, a singular presidential vision of how the government's supposed to run. And I think that's what we're all watching play out in real time these days.
And audience tuning in, please feel free to add your follow-up questions to the professor in the chat. And I'm wondering, as you talk about that, Rob, how is accountability playing out now? So you're saying the Constitution was designed to limit authority for one singular person. How are we doing?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to say. I mean, what you're seeing predictably is a lot of lawsuits. Which is often how these kinds of disputes are litigated. You open with the question, wait, can he do that? And often that's a question that goes to the courts. Someone will claim that the president has done something that he's not allowed to do, or has neglected to do something that he's obligated to do. And the court's role has typically been to try and adjudicate. The law says this, or the Constitution says this, and the president either has or hasn't lived up to these obligations. Courts are slow. They take a long time to work. Cases, as we know, take a long time to work through the courts. And, the president is moving at sort of lightning speed to try and change the state of affairs on the ground in a lot of federal agencies and lots of corners of the federal government. So courts will take a long time, and then we have to assume that the president is going to abide by decisions of courts once these cases work their way through. Another way that there are often limits imposed on presidents is through Congress. Congress still retains a lot of power. Congress appropriates money. Congress can change the law. Congress can write down rules that constrain the president's ability to do things. So far, we've seen a very quiet Congress, but I think as the consequences of the things that the president is trying to do become more apparent, I suspect that you'll see Congress wake up a little bit and realize that, they're either implicated or victimized. Their power is being chipped away. So I think a large part of the accountability will have to come through Congress.
I would hope so. It's been a little concerning recently to watch all these politicians, these elected officials, just sit by, especially as their authority has been kind of chipped away at. Acts of Congress that they have appropriated themselves kind of be disregarded, especially at the hand of an unelected man in the form of Elon Musk. And so that lack, you mentioned accountability, and I hope it comes, because so far in the past couple of weeks where it hasn't been, it's almost felt a bit like a free-for-all, which that question of can he do that has been a question that I've been asking myself and people around me, mostly because it feels like right now he can do whatever he wants and accountability may trickle in later, but as of right now, there seems to be no accountability.
I saw you nodding as as Rob was speaking, and I imagine many folks in the audience are nodding along as well. And I'm to you, Ido, your research with the professor here focuses on civil rights and the New Deal and the effects of historical political situations. You told me that you discussed with Rob that FDR, a Democratic hero, and President Trump, who I would say is not a Democratic hero, are alike. How would you compare FDR and President Trump? A surprising, for me at least, a surprising comparison.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very provocative comparison between the two, especially like you mentioned. Each of the parties kind of idolize the opposite person, and I think there's very few people in the country today that would idolize both of these figures. But I think there's a lot of comparisons that people don't think of immediately, but they're really there. Just to tell the story of FDR, right, to find the similarities here, I think they're going to jump out, right? FDR was elected, or he campaigned and then got elected at a time of great upheaval. A lot of people in the country felt left behind by their government, especially economically. In the wake of the Great Depression, people were jobless, they needed help, and the government, in their mind, wasn't doing enough to help. And so they wanted a candidate of change, and that change came in the form of FDR. And when he got elected into office, he kind of he believed he had a mandate to change. And so he did. His first act as president was to shut down the banks. There was already a smaller bank holidays within the states after a secondary run of the banks that happened in 1933. And he created this national bank holiday to stop the run. And he told Congress, let's do something about this. He also took the US off the gold standard. Within the first 100 days of his presidency, I think of 15 acts were passed, right? And so at the time, this is huge rapid change within the span of a couple weeks, months, right? And I think for a lot of people at the time, it was really alarming of how much power the presidency, and in his case, the federal government at large, was collecting for itself, right? A lot of these famous alphabet soup agencies that he created had a lot of power that the federal government never had before. The TVA was one that come to my mind, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? The power vilification by the government was to me, I think, kind of new, right? And so there's a lot of similarities between these two presidents in terms of shared situations of coming into office, of shared goals, of visions. And so to me, there's a really interesting question of like, these are so similar. So why is one, and depending on which side you are, it's a different question, but why is one praised and the other a cause for concern or being scared, right? And I think there's many, many directions to go with that. For me, within the research that me and Professor Lieberman have been doing, right, it comes to a word we used earlier, which is accountability. Our research deals with the civil rights movement and kind of trying to figure out why in the United States this movement finally succeeded with the civil rights state in the 1950s and 60s. What made those decades conducive for civil rights legislation? And I looked a lot at organizational ties and Black officials in the government, specifically in the FDR years. Wilson segregated the government when he was president, and there was kind of a lull with no Black officials. And then under FDR, a few started coming in, and they unofficially formed this group called the Black Cabinet. They were mostly race relations advisors within the separate alphabet soup New Deal organizations. And they formed this group led by Mary McLeod Bethune, who was one of these Black officials, to kind of hold the government accountable in a way to make sure that these New Deal organizations were fair and applied to everyone, no matter of race. And to me, that's been a really big critical difference between FDR and the current administration is that idea of accountability to the people and to everyone and the people you appoint to government, right? A lot of these appointments weren't made by FDR directly. They were made by people who he appointed to these separate things, right? But the idea was to hold accountable and to make sure that voices are heard in a way. And when I try to think of the people that the president has appointed now, the one that comes to mind is Elon Musk, which is a name I already mentioned earlier, right? It's a lot of these more yes men or people who follow blindly and don't really challenge the status quo. And so to me, that's a big difference between these two in this comparison.
So This is also a provocative idea. And Rob, I'm wondering, in part because I heard Ido's mom might be on the Zoom tonight, as is my mom. So hi to all the parents and family members out there. Does Ido get an A on this analysis, or are there anything that you would sort of blue pen to say, let's think about it this way?
No, 100% he gets an A. No, what I would add is think a little bit about the opposition to FDR. I mean, the comparison is interesting, not just because of what they tried to do, but the terms of the opposition. FDR did a series of things involving tariffs, which are in the news a lot again lately, and his plan to restructure the Supreme Court in 1937 by adding a number of seats to gain faster control over the Supreme Court. And the people who were opposed him exactly on the grounds that you hear now. You know, this guy's trying to become a dictator. He's blowing through the constitutional limits on presidential authority. He doesn't believe in the Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. So the claim that FDR was trying to sort of grab tyrannical power were very similar to the kinds of things we're hearing now. I think where Ido is exactly right is that the difference is Roosevelt saw this as part of a way of reconstructing democracy at a time in the world when democracy felt very fragile. People were looking across the Atlantic in the middle of the Depression and saw authoritarian governments and emerging totalitarian governments in Europe that seemed to have a better handle on what to do about the Depression than the United States. So there was a lot of sort of envious looking at Europe. And Roosevelt wisely restrained himself. He said, that's not the way to reconstruct American government and the American economy. Even though he left the president with a lot more tools of control of the economy and society than when he came into office.
So I'm seeing a lot of questions come through on the chat around accountability and how are the three branches of government holding each other accountable, and the fourth branch of federal government, the people. Charles asked a question on this, I think James did, where we've touched on points in American history when the nation has dealt with expansion of executive power. So you both posited that over time, the role of the president has gotten bigger and bigger. Are there points in history where you could look to either when accountability worked, or whether through other branches of government or the people, or where, like now, there's a lot of argument that Congress is being very passive and not taking up the authority that they have? Are there points in history where a similar dynamic has played out? And I know you do a lot of work on the role of people. How might you answer that?
Sure. I mean, very quickly on the role of Congress, I can't think of an exact example. To me, what's interesting about FDR is when he had his plan in 1937, 1938 to enlarge the court, he wanted to stack more justices in because the Supreme Court was turning down a lot of his New Deal organizations. A lot of the opposition to him came from other Democrats in Congress, right? So it was a time where Congress, his own party, did hold him accountable for potential aggrandizement. I think in terms of the people, a lot of my research deals with that, with Professor Lieberman, right? Of the role of these everyday people, of lower level government officials, of people with passion to affect change, right? So in our case, it's kind of the opposite, where the civil rights state was a move to get more power to the federal government, take it from the states, and so the executive could act. To me, the ultimate example of the people and organizations having a say in this would be the 1941 March on Washington, the proposed March on Washington, where Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights advocate and also the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and White of the NAACP, wanted to start a march on Washington, which would eventually happen in 1963, but to have this march to lobby the federal government and to pressure them into civil rights legislation. And it worked. The march never happened in 1941 because of the passing of the FEPC, which was a board to start to limit segregation and more racial discrimination in the government, right? And the way it was passed was through connections, right? So the Black cabinet, many of them had connections both to the NAACP and to A. Philip Randolph. Some of them had connections to the White House. Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the head of this group, had a connect friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And so they were a back channel of communication between the Oval Office and the Black cabinet. But all of these people who are individuals in their own right were able to use the minimal authority they had. They were all lower level government officials or advocates or activists, right? They were not in levels of high position. And they were able to pass some, executive order to help racial discrimination, at least begin the move to limit and to end racial discrimination by the federal government. And so this is just one example of many of people taking into their own hands and trying to change the federal power and how much power they have.
The other example that I think is useful here, the other historical example is Watergate, which was a moment when a powerful president, a president who by the time Nixon was president, the presidency was more powerful than it was for Roosevelt, largely because of the evolution of the national security apparatus during World War II and the Cold War. So Nixon comes into office, and unlike Roosevelt, and more like Trump, is a fairly unscrupulous operator who wants to use the powers that he has as president to, punish his enemies, to get himself reelected, to keep himself in power. And a lot of the schemes, the sort of famous, some of these are outlandish schemes, firebomb the Brookings Institution and kidnap Democratic operatives around the time of the 1972 Republican National Convention so they can't disrupt the convention. Are ways that the president is trying to use his power to keep himself in office and use his authority to keep himself in power. Eventually, he gets brought down by a coalition of both Republicans and Democrats, but it took a very long time, right? As and my other students will tell you, I became utterly obsessed with Watergate in the last few years. Mostly because I wanted to know how long did the Republican Party stick with Nixon when even after they realized that he was, they knew he was an unscrupulous character from the beginning. And the answer is a very long time. And so there's a dual lesson here. One is it's not easy for a party to give up its own guy. But this was a time when the other parts of the political system, the courts, the Congress, the press, and the public sort of played their prescribed roles in the constitutional system, right? When the evidence became overwhelming that Nixon had committed a criminal act in the Oval Office, he was pushed out. That's a picture of it's of a somewhat well-functioning democratic system. And that's where all these questions about accountability, I think, leave us today. What are the mechanisms and where are we looking for the kind of accountability that the system was able to muster 50 years ago that seem to be a little bit quiet today?
Well, I think what I'm hearing is like the economy goes up and down. There are booms and busts, but over time, the American economy is growing. Am I correct in hearing that presidential power and the powers of the other branches, they go up and down as well? Presidential authority has been mostly, like the American economy, on an upward trajectory, but there are places we can look to in history where other branches of government or the people have expanded or contracted the role of the president. Do I get an A?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's right. I mean, presidential power has largely grown for a number of reasons. Mostly because what we expect of the government has gotten a lot bigger and a lot more complicated. So that Congress by itself can't can't operate the machinery of government. The government's gotten too big and too complicated. And so Congress has delegated to the president a lot of authority to manage the affairs of the government, to make everyday decisions, to make policy decisions, to make regulations and rules that govern how policy operates. So a lot of the presidential power is not because unscrupulous presidents have grabbed it, it's because the other branches have given it to them. On top of that, we're in a period when it's becoming increasingly difficult for Congress to act. Congress is getting very kludgy. The parties are in very tight competition with supermajority rules and other ways Congress operates. It's very hard for Congress to act. And the temptation for presidents of both parties to use their unilateral power to make policy decisions is very great. So you've seen this sort of ratchet effect over time of presidential power. It's not just one party or the other. And that, has sort of opened the door for a president like Trump, who has an extremely expansive view of the powers of the president and seems to believe in this theory that there are essentially no limits on presidential executive authority. That leaves the door open for someone like that to do these kind of sweeping things that we're seeing him undertaking in the last couple of weeks.
This is reflective of a question I don't even think you saw, but you're responding to some audience questions around the question Cindy posed was, if Democrats were to regain power, should they be using the same actions to promote their agenda? Or, stated differently, and I think this is to Rob, are these tools nonpartisan?
That's a really hard question because, yes, in principle they are. And you've seen, as I said, both Democratic and Republican presidents in the last 20 or 30 years try to use these unilateral tools of governance to pursue an agenda. Think about President Biden trying a variety of different ways to forgive student loan debt without Congress. There comes a point, though, when we think of these tools as anti-democratic, right? Go back to what I said earlier about the Constitution. The Constitution set up the presidency as an office that is constrained to operate by law and is not supposed, we don't want to, the Constitution is designed to keep too much power out of the hands of one person. So at some point, actions like this we worry that they become undemocratic. And this is a very hard question. Is it okay to use undemocratic methods in the service of what we think of as democracy? Right? Listen to the arguments that the Trump administration is making for the things that they're doing. Their arguments sound small d democratic also, right? This president has a mandate. He was elected to do these things. And any opposition to his ability to do these things is undemocratic, right? I don't necessarily agree with those arguments, but they're couched in a language of democratic legitimacy. So that's a very, very difficult question. What are the limits of what an opposition party should be willing to do in the service of preserving democratic government and democratic limits on power?
I saw you nodding. Is there?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think in terms of should the Democrats use it or should be allowed to use it, right? To me, a lot of these movements today, and I'm not a legal expert, so don't take my opinion as fact, right? But to me, a lot of these movements, the way the policy is being accomplished is scary, right? It's a lot of things that, for example, USAID is an example of, like, whether you think it should be defunded or not is a different question, right? It's more of a policy-based question. But the way it was done, right, an appropriation of Congress being struck down by the president without congressional approval, right? The method of doing that to me is scary. And so I'm hesitant to say, yeah, the Democrats should do it too, right? Because now if you have neither party playing by the rules of our constitution of democracy, then it's scary. It's kind of boring to say, but I am on the side of democracy here, right? Not either party, right? But I want our systems of checks and balances to stay in power. The reason they're there. Oftentimes they're frustrating. Congress is slow and it's hyperpolarized now, but it's never been very fast, kind of the point. Same with the courts. They've never been the fastest thing either. Today, we're in a state of very hyperpolarization. And so it's a very different situation. But at its essence, democracy is not meant to be exciting, right? And so when you have someone who wants a lot of change, playing by the rules of democracy kind of counteracts that very idea of fast, rapid change. But I would caution to say that the other party should also use these tools because what then? Right? And I think it's a very common question of right now, like Trump are using these rules, but if he is taking away all these checks and balances or the stops or just cutting things whenever he wants, right? What of the next administration that now have these tools at their disposal, right? How would people who support these cuts, for example, feel about future cuts if the same tools are being used here, right? I think it's a very, very complicated question. I would not love seeing these tools utilized further because it does scare me of where do we go next and how do we make sure that there is a separation between Congress and the presidency and how do we make sure Congress still has their power?
What do we have? That's a common question in the chat is why is Congress, do you have hypotheses as to why Congress is not taking up more authority? I do want to name, my understanding is Congress is not your area of study as I understand it. So trying to be mindful of the expertise we have in the room. Do you have hypotheses or points in history that can inform why Congress might be not expansive in its power right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the hold that Trump has over the Republican Party. Republicans have majorities in both houses of Congress. So really, in order for anything to happen seriously in Congress, at least the Republican Party leadership in Congress would have to be giving it some impetus, and they're just not doing that. Although, I think you'll see cracks of daylight. So, for example, in the rash of firings in the last couple of days, one of the offices that got hit was the 9/11, the healthcare for 9/11 workers, so people who were affected by work at Ground Zero in the weeks and months after 9/11. And that was an office where a lot of people were fired. It's going to hamper the work of the office and limit the services that are available to those people. And that provoked a letter from a bunch of Republican members of Congress from the New York City area, whose constituents are going to be affected by this. So I think you'll see Congress start to wake up a little bit as the downstream consequences of all of these actions become more apparent. Mm-hmm. This has not been at all a sort of surgical operation, just cutting the fat in government budgets or just cutting the things that affect Democrats or anything like that. This is Elon Musk doing to the federal government what he did to Twitter when he bought it, right? It's just sweeping away whatever's in his path. And that's going to have real life consequences for people and for programs and for things that people expect the government to do. And I think once those things become apparent, that causes problems for other elected officials.
Yeah, I mean, next month the debt ceiling issue is going to come back, right? That's in the March is the moratorium on the last one they passed back in December, and we saw how much problem that caused, including a provision that Trump had asked for that did not make it to the final thing. And so I hope that as more contentious issues are brought up, there will be more disagreement. I think especially because in the House, Republicans have such a narrow majority that all you need is a couple rogue party members, and the bill can't be passed. And I think once we get to those more contentious issues or issues that people think of as more immediate, I think most people don't think of a lot of the cuts that have happened so far as immediate needs. There are a lot of things that happen kind of in the background, and so you don't really think about how the CDC or the NIH or the consumer, the CFBP, I think, I forget the exact name of this. Like, you don't think about how those influence your everyday things as much as you do for other agencies. But I think, like Professor Lieberman said, once those impacts start feeling, whether it be through a natural disaster and FEMA has been kind of lobbled or hobbed, or another pandemic, God forbid, but it might happen, and the CDC can't roll out anything or can't even detect the virus, right? These smaller things that are bound to happen, or a war abroad, right? And we can no longer provide adequate aid. I think as these things that now don't feel immediate, but will at some point be immediate, start to be felt, I think there will be, hopefully, or I hope, there will be a bit more pushback from Congress and a bit less of this rolling over and letting him do whatever he wants.
I think I just want to follow up on one thing that Ido said, which is exactly right, which is the moment that's coming up next month where the government funding will run out and we hit the debt limit. That's going to be a moment of truth for the Democrats. Back to the question about, should the Democrats play tit for tat here? The last few years, the way this has happened is the Republicans with very small majorities, especially in the House, have not been able to pass budget legislation or debt ceiling legislation, and the Democrats have saved their bacon, right? The Democrats have come through and voted for these things so that Republicans can defect and the government doesn't shut down or the government doesn't default. The Democrats are going to have to think hard next time around about whether they want to come to the rescue of the Republicans in the House and probably in the Senate. I think the Senate is a little more manageable for the Republicans, but in the House especially, where there are a handful of Republican members who have shown that they're just unwilling to vote for a debt ceiling increase or unwilling to vote for spending bills. And there's going to come a point when they're going to need Democratic votes to keep the government open. And that'll be the moment when the Democrats have to decide what they're going to do.
I've been pulling questions from the audience, not always fully citing the person asking the questions, but I've been pulling themes from the audience. There are a lot of questions around the future. Is a third term likely? What might happen? If these changes happen, can things be restored, or once Humpty Dumpty is broken, can it be put back together again? There are some specifics, like is a third term likely, but I'm also wondering, how are you, I'll start with Ido this time, like it's a rapid news cycle. How are you like processing everything that's incoming and making sense of it? And are you doing some fortune telling?
I mean, I think just for the third term question, I think no, hopefully. I think I have enough faith in our institutions that won't happen, especially seeing as that is enshrined in the Constitution. And our current Supreme Court very much is an originalist reading of the Constitution, and they do love to stick very strictly to the Constitution. And I don't say you can circumvent the third term, but it's so clearly written. But I think in general, the future, I don't know. I wish I had answers. I think it's also funny because, when I first started working with Dr. Lieberman, he kind of asked me, as like, when was my first political real memory? This was 2.5 years ago. And I told him my first real memory of American politics when I got interested was the first Trump election, right? That's the world that me and a lot of my fellow students and people my age grew up with, right? This is the world we know. We don't really remember the rules base and everything before, right? And so telling the future is impossible. I don't think anyone 2 years ago, a year ago, could have predicted where we are today. I hope that Congress starts to stand up, and I think as kind of court cases come through, I hope that more of the checks start reappearing, right? And the realization that there is no absolute power, that no one has absolute power. I do hope that the president abides to the court rulings. I think he said that he would, but there's also some questions there. Staying sane in all of this is difficult. I think it's a lot. I think just keeping up with the news constantly coming on and on and on, and every day there's something new. It's never boring. There's never a second of rest. I don't have predictions for the future. I think it's difficult to tell. I try to be cautiously optimistic usually, but I think there's gonna be a lot more questioning and prodding of boundaries before we kind of see where it ends. And I think if there are no checks, whether it be from Congress or the courts or from the people, right? We said the fourth branch, the people, the press, if none of these groups attack and stick to the boundary, then there's kind of a problem for the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that worries me is the Humpty Dumpty problem that you pointed to, Mary. I mean, I think it's going to be very hard in some cases to repackage or restructure some of the things that are being unwound in the government. Um, the government is not just a bunch of rules and a bunch of people in offices. The government operates through connections with organizations of the kind that Ido was talking about before, that we've been researching in history. The government, has lots of experts who are in their jobs because they know how to do the things that they're hired to do. And if those people are let go, and if these offices are unstructured, you can't just replace USAID or the Consumer Financial Protection Board overnight. These are things that have been years or decades in the building, and have sort of slowly and carefully put together the pieces to do what they do. Do they do it perfectly? No. Is the government the most efficient operation in the world? No. But by and large, does it do good in the world, and does it effectively, execute on the things that Congress and the president have designed and instructed it to do? Yeah, for the most part. And I think losing that capacity is going to be very hard to recover. So that's one of the things. That's a little bit of a less cautiously optimistic view than Ido had. But that's really one of the things I worry about.
There are questions in the chat around the toll of human suffering. So we started this conversation with what is the role of the president? What does the Constitution say? And we talked about the accountability of the three branches. So if we're holding that at the center of the conversation, when I first pitched this idea to Rob, you said, these aren't just theories. This is about daily life. This is people's lives. And I think sometimes, to me, even working at a democracy institute, like, what does that term really mean? And for me, it's things like taking care of a neighbor and like being able to go to the ballot box. There's like daily actions that make it real. So how are you thinking about, or how might we think about hope, or the hope for democracy? What does this mean for citizens, or folks across the country and around the globe? Easy question.
I mean, sure.
This is an essay question, not a multiple
sure.
choice.
No, I think that's a really serious question, and I think we're already beginning to see some of those consequences. I mean, the most startling thing to me is the destructuring of USAID, the Agency for International Development, this was started by President Kennedy. So this is more than 60 years old, and this is the main vehicle for foreign humanitarian assistance by the United States to other countries. The sort of just turning off the spigots altogether on USAID is going to affect health projects and hunger projects and housing projects and things that are on the ground that Americans are doing with American aid dollars all over the world. A lot of them run through Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is a very, very large USAID contractor. So you're going to see, immediate impact there. But that has ripples, right? It's not just the places in the world where USAID is providing humanitarian assistance. It's the American companies that make the things that USAID buys and sends overseas. It's the farmers whose food USAID buys and sends overseas. So you're going to see secondary and third order effects of these cuts pretty quickly. You're going to, you're already seeing at the more trivial end of the scale. I read a story yesterday about the Park Service. The National Park Service fired a bunch of employees the other day, and the lines to get into the Grand Canyon went from half an hour to get into the parking lot to 2 hours or something like that. It's a small trivial example, but I think we're going to begin to see the consequences of this sort of blunderbuss approach to these cuts in people's everyday lives. And as Ido is absolutely right, there's going to be another pandemic. There's going to be natural disasters. There are going to be transportation accidents or other kinds of things where people expect the government to respond. And the government needs the tools to respond, and those tools are not going to be there. And I think that's when, that to me is going to be another moment of truth. And this is for the Republican Party. They're going to own this when it turns out the government has been so undermined that it can't respond effectively to the things that people need. And that to me, if there's a sort of note of optimism, it's a backwards kind of optimism, right? Something really bad is going to happen. And that's going to force the government to change the way it does business. That's a terrible way to do business. But I think that's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think back to the original question of the suffering or the human toll, or, being a student now, I have a lot of friends who just recently graduated or trying to graduate and looking for jobs post-graduation, right? So on the very human level, you have this huge abstract USAID or whatever. I have friends today at the NIH who have a job description and basically that's it, right? All the out of it was cut. The conferences were cut, the travel budgets were cut, the journals were cut, so there's no really path forward. I have friends who are currently applying for jobs and for internships. I have a very good friend who is applying for jobs, and she had bookmarked a bunch of jobs back in December, and half of those jobs don't exist anymore. The websites just aren't there anymore. And so it seems trivial and very small, but it's a lot of people, that's how they make their livelihood, that's their path forward, that's their day-to-day, and it's being cut, and it's a scary time to try to apply for jobs, especially in the federal government in that area, when there is no certainty of will that job exist in 2 weeks, tomorrow, who knows?
Some folks wanted to be where we are today. Some folks thought some folks voted, half the voters voted for Trump. Half the voters didn't. Some people wanted it. Some people thought
slightly less than half the voters voted for Trump, I'll point out.
Fair. I got math check, very important. And what I'm learning tonight is that through history, expansion of the powers is what people in power often try to do. So Charles asked this question, and it was also relates to the final question I was planning to queue up. Whether you want to keep the ball rolling or you want accountability in a different way, what are the 2 to 3 things that history teaches us that citizens can do to be that active part of the fourth branch of government? And part of this, it's layered in here somewhere too, there's a conversation around the influence of money. I'm thinking about what's different today about than during FDR or during Nixon. The government's a lot bigger. There's the staff of the government is the largest workforce in the country, if not the world. So there are things that make being an active participant in democracy today different than the past. But what are some of those tools we could look to?
Yeah, as I told Mary earlier, this is the question that usually makes me look at my shoes and mumble. I think the first thing people can do is pay attention. A lot of this happens. A lot of these things have happened, you know, a couple of layers down from the visible parts of the government over time. So, who was paying attention to these kinds of associational connections that Ido was talking about, or the Black Cabinet when those people were meeting and trying to nudge the government in different directions? Um, um, so I think paying attention. And one of the really interesting things that I've seen in the last couple of weeks is much more attention um, being paid by the media to the sort of ordinary everyday workings of the government, right? Who are all these people? There are 2 million people who work for the federal government. Who are they? What do they do? How do they get hired? How do you usually fire them? How are their performance reviews done? So I think one of the things we're getting out of this is a much more textured public appreciation of how the government works. So I think the first thing people can do is pay attention and keep paying attention. And I think that will allow people to make more nuanced and careful decisions about how they're voting, and how they're communicating with their representatives and communicating in the public. Rather than the sort of great yawp of despair, which we're all prone to, we need sort of people to be able to ask pointed and careful questions about, what the government is doing and what the consequences are going to be. So that's thing one I would say is just pay careful attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people, right? We've talked about the people as the fourth branch, and we mentioned the people here and there in organizations and associations. I think that's a really big thing. I think oftentimes we think of the federal government or Washington or the White House as this distant secret room, a cabal of people who no one knows about. It's shady and it's dark, right? But not necessarily. The people have a voice, both in elections and also outside of elections, right? Whether it be through public protests or whether it be through everyday civics and organizations. By banding together, by helping each other, and also by lobbying the government, there's kind of a dual level there, both on the local level and also the national level. But by being there for each other and also holding others accountable, which is a word that we keep coming back to, right? We can affect change. The midterms are coming up in a year and a half, and that sounds a little far away, but that is one official channel for accountability. A more unofficial one is those civics, those organizations, those associations, whether it be helping a friend out or helping a neighbor out in a time where a service they relied on by the federal government has been cut, or whether it be lobbying or going to the government or getting in those positions and jobs to affect change from the inside or outside. I think we often forget how much power each of us as an individual person has. And as difficult as it is to remember that, especially with the barrage of all the information and all the discouraging news that keeps coming at us, remembering that core that every person matters and every person has a voice is a bit of a way to stay sane in this whole situation and to affect change.
I'm reflecting on the importance of community, the importance of like one action at a time, one step at a time, and ending where we started around that we're building an Agora together. We're building a community together, and we're all lifelong learners. So I also want to turn this question to the audience the way we did at the beginning, which is, Charles asked us, what are 2 to 3 citizen things we all can do? Phrased a little bit differently, after this hour together, what's something you learned today that you might want to share with a friend? Or what might you want to do today that's different than an hour ago? Or like, how are you? Just how are you? Checking in with the group. And I'll put that question to the community. And I will also, as those answers come in, ask the same question to Rob and Ido as we work to close it out. How are you doing after this conversation, and any final recommendations?
One thing I will say is I'm teaching a course this semester that I teach periodically called The Future of American Democracy, which I now kind of think maybe there should be a question mark in the course title. But I've got to say, watching my students sort of try and process this in a serious way and take it very seriously is really pretty, reassuring and inspiring. I mean, students like Ido's not in this class; he's been in other classes with me. But watching students really try to grapple with this is gives me a little bit of hope.
Yeah, I have a different class that is related actually in topic through the Agora Institute actually. It's called How to Beat Autocrats, Lesson from the Front Lines of Democracy for the United States. I think it's the full name. It's a long title. But the idea of democracy and speaking about it, and I think one of the most helpful things we've had is just debriefs about the past week, the news, what's happening, community conversations, talking to people. I think that's how I've kept saying, both in like, can you believe this happened? And also like, what do you think about this? And bouncing ideas, even if we disagree on things, but just, know that you're not going through it by yourself and everyone else is also seeing it and you can talk about it, to me has been a great help. And also at other times, just distractions and watching a stupid show or whatever it might be, just to get my mind off of the constant news that are coming in.
I'm seeing some gratitude in the chat around the helpful reminder that people also, that we hold power, and that there are a lot of great organizations out there that are helping in this moment. People have the power of the purse. Calls to get involved, calling your members of Congress, and that the conversation was thought-provoking. Two final thoughts and two requests to the community as we move to close. One is please take a moment to fill out a survey. This is an ongoing dialogue, so we'll be dropping a link to an event survey where we'll ask your ideas and feedback for the future, and also a very sincere invitation to upcoming events. We, as I shared, have a full series of events, including, we talked about USAID. We have a former attorney for USAID joining us next month, as well as topics on what's happening in Baltimore, what's happening with Mexican and Canadian tariffs, a robust calendar virtually, and if you're in the area in Baltimore and DC as well. So please take a moment to fill out the survey before you log out and sign up for more. Just want to end with a huge amount of gratitude for the Agora tonight, to Rob, to Ido, for the Hopkins at Home teams, to our partners across the country. And time is our most precious resource, and I'm grateful to have spent it with all of you tonight. So thank you for hosting us, Hopkins at Home, and thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us today. I look forward to continuing to learn and do with all of you.